for the CBD meeting, and just trying to see these linkages. So once again, formally welcoming you all for this event, virtual event, enabling her, Indigenous women and their access to climate and biodiversity finance. This event has been co-convened together with Women for Biodiversity, Afib, and FIMI. Before we start, I just also would like to inform you that to be able to outreach and make sure that we have more participation, interpretation is also being provided, supported in French and Spanish. Just to some house logistics, so guidance for attendees, please, we encourage all of you to please put in your name and organization in the chat. So we also have know where everybody's calling from. And also, so please write your name and full organization in your Zoom name also. Please also direct your questions in chat. Type your questions and comments in the chat box. Indicate your country and for who among the speakers your question is for. And also encouraging that if you're running out of time, we also encourage our panelists to also take the opportunity of those questions and may also feel free to respond them in the chat also. For the language, to choose language for the event, please click on the globe in the Zoom button below and select the language that you would like to have the interpretation for. So thank you very much for being here. Can you go to the next one, Claire? Claire, can you change the slide? So before we go, we just wanted to have broaden this the objective of what you're really looking for the side event. So it's to bring the voices and experiences of Indigenous women and their role in the climate and biodiversity solution, bringing the perspectives of Indigenous women and funders community on the need and urgency of gender-friendly climate and biodiversity financing. Also, to understand the roles of the philanthropy community in building and developing plans and strategies in supporting Indigenous women and their organizations, networks, and their agencies. So a question would be is, what kind of accountability mechanism needs to set to increase access? So having set this objective, please let me start also by giving my own introductions. My name is Mrinalini Rai, and I'm the Director for Women for Biodiversity, and I will be moderating today's session. So today we have an amazing and wonderful panelist, a group of strong, absolutely, and have known some of them for a very long time, advocates working on Indigenous women's in different forums, from the global to the national to the local. So I'm just going to quickly give an introduction for all the speakers. So first, we'll be also having the opening remarks from Lotus, from Afib. And before we go further, we will first start our event with a spiritual opening by Rita Tapa from Nepal. So before taking much time, I will ask Rita to please take us to this opening. So just introduction, Rita Tapa is from the Magar Indigenous peoples in Nepal, and she currently works with the Indigenous Women Legal Awareness Group. So please, Rita.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rita Tapa Magar from Invalag. Indigenous greetings to everyone. Now we are going to perform the spiritual opening of this session. So we Indigenous are very interconnected to the land and our Mother Earth. So right now I'm offering this flower vase to our ancestor, and We put water on a plant. So right now I have this one. So I'm offering water to the Mother Earth and water to our ancestors and water to our east side, west side, south, and north. And I'm offering flowers too. And I have lighted the lamp to worship our ancestor and the God. And similar way, this incense. And the prayer string. Similarly, I'm offering these fruits to our God, our ancestor, for our good health and interconnected with the earth, Mother Earth. And we offer this scarf to our ancestor. And we also offer the water to our well-wisher and our relatives, family, and friends. And we also offer this holy water to our backbiters so that they can correct us and show us the right path. And praise for the peace and success. Thank you.
Rita, thank you so very much for this beautiful opening and blessing this session. That was really very beautiful. So thank you so much for taking the time. So having that auspicious opening to our event, I take this opportunity to welcome Lotus, Inga, the Executive Director for Afib. So Lotus has over 2 decades of experience in international philanthropy at foundations and nonprofits dedicated to Indigenous rights, gender equality, and social justice. Lotus, under her leadership, Afib is expanding Indigenous philanthropy, supporting the leadership of Indigenous-led funds, and advocating for greater funding resources for Indigenous peoples. So without any further ado, Lourdes, please, would like to have your welcoming remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Right. So thank you for the welcome. My name is Lourdes Inga. I'm Quechua descent from Peru and Executive Director of International Funders for Indigenous Peoples, also known as IFIP or EFIP. And I join you today from the ancestral lands of the Maidu and Isinan peoples here in Northern California. As an objective, IFIP as an organization, we educate and promote thought, collaboration, and partnerships between philanthropy and Indigenous peoples worldwide. As an organization, we're also advocating that the philanthropic community needs to increase funding and directly support Indigenous peoples. We also would like the philanthropy community to address the inequities on the lack of funding and the inclusion of Indigenous peoples when it comes to philanthropic funding. Now, according to the ILO, Indigenous peoples represent 476 million of the world population. We have also heard from many different reports that Indigenous peoples manage and steward 80% of the world's biodiversity. Now, half of these 476 million people are Indigenous women. And as we have heard many times over from different UN agencies, different reports, Indigenous women also are key actors when it comes to climate change and biodiversity. They're custodians of seeds, they're keepers of medicinal plants, and they're guardians of biodiversity. They also hold key traditional knowledge that is critical in the context of climate change and sustainable development. But as you will hear today, Indigenous women are visionaries, are change makers, and are also right holders. In the occasion of CSIVU, when we're looking at achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs, Afib is proud to partner with FEMI and Women for Biodiversity to raise the visibility, agency, and leadership of Indigenous women. Indigenous women play a critical role in their communities, nationally and globally. Direct access to finance and philanthropic funding is key to support their work and their initiatives. For this reason, Afib calls on philanthropy to increase their level of funding to Indigenous women organizations, networks, and Indigenous women's funds, not just with the small grants, but with the same large investments that philanthropy directs to other organizations working to achieve gender equality, systemic change, and to tackle the critical crisis on climate change and the protection of biodiversity. It is a pleasure for me to be here with all of you to listen to each of the speakers who will be sharing with you how Indigenous women are playing a role at various levels. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Miranali.
Thank you, Lotus, for setting the stage of what the purpose of this webinar is. Also, sharing with all the colleagues, this is a very optimal time for us because as we are in New York for the CSW 66, the parallel discussion where I'm calling from in Geneva, attending the CBD's UN Convention on Biological Diversity discussion. And there are these parallel synergies. And of course, financing is one of the biggest discussions taking place here too. Looking at following up on Lotus, that was really very important to really understand the roles and contributions of women, but also looking at that their rights to their resources lacks, but also funding. We always forget about that part. And even we need to support women, Indigenous women and their networks and organizations with also funding. So having said that, I would now invite three of our panel speakers in a roundtable discussion. So first, I'll give an introduction to all the three speakers. We have Jing Corpus, who is a Kankanaya Igorot from the Peoples of the Mountain Province of the Philippines. She's a lawyer by profession and is the global policy and advocacy lead for Niatero. The second panelist that we have on our event is Kanlaya. Kanlaya Chilaratnakon is an Indigenous woman and also were Indigenous women and has been advocating for the rights of Indigenous women in Thailand. She is from Indigenous Women Network in Thailand. And she has also contributed more than a decade of her work building capacities of Indigenous women, including working on a violation on the rights of Indigenous women in Thailand. The third panelist that we have today is Diana D'Amico. She is a young Indigenous woman from the Ibara Ayabada people from the Cobarda Carnaval Alto San Jorge Reservation from Colombia. She has experience in community processes with the youth, women, and has allowed her to acquire the foundations to convene and guide youth and women's spaces and communities. She's currently part of the network of Indigenous Women of Latin America and the Caribbean, and is a focal point for the South in the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. So a warm welcome to all of you. If you kind of give me, can I ask all the speakers to come online with their video? Okay, thank you so very much. So the way that we wanted to set up today's discussion was not with presentations, but really hosting this event in the realities and experiences of Indigenous women. So I'm going to be asking questions, and also for colleagues who are online, please feel free to post on the chat your questions. And we have some of our colleagues here who will be assisting us, also including if you have any technical issues with interpretation, please let us know. I will try my best to speak slowly, so make sure that the interpretation is helpful. So first, Kanlaya and Diana, from your experience, because you're working so much on the ground as a youth also. So Kanlaya first. So I want to ask is, what are the impacts of environmental degradation, and also the role that Indigenous women play in providing solutions?
Okay, good evening. Now it's 8 p.m. in Thailand. Now, so it's evening time here in Thailand. Yes. Firstly, I would like to thank Tina now for having me in this forum now. As for your questions now, the impacts of environmental degradation on the Indigenous women. There are different impacts now. There are direct impacts and also indirect impacts. Now the direct impacts now is the how to say because of the change of the temperature, and also the water is getting dry, and the land become infertile. So this has resulted in the production, of our crops. Most of indigenous people, especially women, are self-sufficient farmers, so they rely very much on the fertility of the soil, and also the the temperature, and also the rain. So when there are degradation of the environment, they are higher temperature. This has been impacted a lot on the production yield of our products at the community levels and this has impacted a lot on the women, children, elders, and also people with disabilities, because they cannot access to enough food and also enough clean drinking waters. This is the direct impacts. And another impacts would be the sickness, the malnutrition problems that faced by our communities, peoples, and this also lead to, we have observed that this has led to some domestic increase in domestic violence also especially for women, children, elders, and also people with disabilities. And for the indirect impacts, the indirect impacts is the laws, the laws and the policies that made by our governments, because of the degradation of environment. Our governments has made many policies and laws on this now based on the agreements now that are made with the international communities now. So for example, in Thailand, in the past 5 years now, our government has promised the international communities that it will increase now the number of forest areas now in the country from 30% to 44% now. And by doing this now, they has in the past 5 years now, they have taken now more than 400 hectares now of the farmland now of indigenous people and also local people now for plantation and also to make national park now to make preserve forest areas now. So because of these policies and this implementation now, many indigenous members now and also local people have been arrested now because they deny now to give their farmland to the project now, the government projects. And yeah, this has this laws and policy of the governments that has double now the challenge now faced by indigenous women in finding enough food for the families, enough water for the families now, with the changing weathers, with the degradation of environment and also the infertile land. No?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jum. No, these are the realities I think that we really need to acknowledge what is also happening currently. And I think they really need to be also addressed, but these are really core issues that are taking place. I want to kind of now go to Diana, and as a youth, as an indigenous woman, could you share also with us the challenges? You know, sometimes we always don't hear the youth very well. So I wanted to hear your experiences and also identifying some the roles that indigenous youth are playing in providing solutions.
En verana mana tawa pan mutrena mato kereza uma y mana viña harayi mata y dura de mata y nama Colombia de bema canenta ni monte warana de mata.
A greeting of fraternity, a greeting from the great Embera nation, from the indigenous peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean, from Colombia. In the first instance, I would like to emphasize how the environment has been impacted and degraded. From the National Indigenous Organization of Colombia and from the Youth Network and from many organizations and foundations, we have been working on those problems that we have in the territory, and it's precisely those that are known as heat waves. In many communities and indigenous territories, we have been concerned. We already have droughts. The streams that were nearby have been drying up, as in the case of Sierra Nevada, on the coast, in La Guajira, places where it now rains little. There are territories that are most affected for the communities, women and young people. A very important event was held for the indigenous youth here in Colombia, where the youth stated that in their territories there were large patches of multinationals where they were excavating and cutting down trees. That feeling that happens in the territory is not planted again. Those trees that were cut down are not planted again in the territories. It is worrying that trees are beginning to be cut down and mega projects are being carried out for multinationals when the peoples do not have that process or that strengthening for the care of the pedagogy towards Mother Earth. We have another case from the Youth Network, a case from Uruguay with the Charrua people, who in the months of January and February had a heat wave of 40 degrees, where it is specified that this heat wave has caused no harvests and we do not have the planting in an ideal way, and the drought in the territory is affecting all indigenous communities. Now, what is happening with the women? What is the role that youth and women as such play in the territory? Is that without a doubt, these impacts become much more serious because the woman is the one who leads the planting process. We are the ones who connect in one way or another with the moon, with the sun, and we look at the lunar calendar to define how the planting will be carried out in the territories, the orchards, in the kitchens. It is difficult to adapt what is happening with climate change and the scarcity that we have in the territory. Women are beginning to suffer. That is why we have to find solutions for planting, nutrition, and care for families and territories. On the other hand, we must take into account that we, women, are the ones who are in the transmission of that ancestral knowledge, so that there is a form of sustenance in the territory. We also have a way to protect ourselves, a territorial way, a spiritual way. There are many women leaders who are in the territories right now giving talks. There are women who are from the grandfathers and grandmothers guiding the indigenous youth on how they should plant trees, which months to do it on, how to make spiritual payments for the heat wave and climate change. This is a way to revitalize the processes in the territories, and that in one way or another, care is taken towards pedagogy and towards Mother Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Diana, for sharing that also a rich experience and the challenges, but also saying that you know, Indigenous women are also leading the solutions. They are taking care of the communities. Before we go further onto the other section, to also talk with Jing about the philanthropy funding support, I just want to kind of go back to Kanlaya again on this question. So these are the problems, and one of the things that we wanted to engage in today's event was the gaps and challenges for Indigenous women to access the climate and biodiversity financing resources. So if you could also share some of your experiences or ways forward.
Okay, thank you very much for these questions. This is very important questions now for us now. As you can see, now I am Indigenous person and I don't speak English very well now. So the gaps and the challenge now for us now as Indigenous women, Indigenous person would be the languages now, because we are Indigenous, we don't speak how to say proper Thai. No, we first learn our mother tongue, and then when we go to school, we will learn Thai, no, which is our national language, and then English after, no, when we are at universities. So many of us don't have the chance to go for universities, so not many speaking English now. So this is our very big challenge now, that we don't really read, speak, and understand English, not even Thai, you know, because we are women, no? We are women, so according to our culture, no, our family would prioritize now the boy, the son, to go to school first. No? So women, not many women get the chance to go for higher education. Many would just finish their education only at 12th grade, no? Or sometimes only 9th grade. So language is our very big challenge. And also another challenge is that because we are a local organization, because in our country now to register as an organization, we need to have quite a big of money, it's about eight thousand USD something, so it's very hard for us to collect this money and to get registered as an organization. So yeah, this has been one big obstacle also now for us, for my organization, and also other local women's organization to get funding support from both domestic and also international funders. Yes.
No, thanks, June. That is very enriching. I think that's one of the key mindfulness we really have to keep, is that we're talking about these big issues like climate and biodiversity financing. We forget that sometimes the hurdle can be as simple as a language barrier, especially for Indigenous peoples. So yeah, and I think what you talked about, and I'm also seeing on the chat, and of course, and Lotus, following from you, I think somebody already made a hashtag saying that not just small funding. I think that is one of the really also issues, is that usually when funding is looked for Indigenous peoples and women, usually the funding resources are comparatively very small. So I like that hashtag. We may use it. I'm just looking at the chat. So that is really very important. Because when you talk about climate and biodiversity finance, these are really huge parts of resource mobilization that have been discussed in spaces, in the international spaces of the UNFCCC. The same thing with the UNCBD. There are millions of dollars being discussed. So, and of course, the lack of institutional capacity. This is also a challenge that hinders the access for not only for Indigenous peoples, but of course makes it more difficult for Indigenous women and youth to get access, just because they're not backed up by some kind of institutional organization or something. So thanks, June. Those are really very simple but very mindful challenges. Diana, the same question for you also, because we're talking about different regions, but I think if you look at a similarity, they will be very common. But also from as a youth, as an Indigenous woman, also in Colombia, the region, what are the gaps and challenges? Are also the same question, assessing climate and biodiversity financing. Yeah. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. In the first instance, the gaps we have as Indigenous women and as youth is definitely the lack of accompaniment. When women and young people are left alone as you will see what you should do, true, and that you will see what you do means defend yourself, do it yourself. And I feel that it is a lack of accompaniment to Indigenous women and youth, because constant accompaniment is needed to know if the projects that arrived, if the calls that arrived are fulfilled in a rigorous way, so that you can, in one way or another, comply with what is requested, because many times there are too many requirements. Another issue is language. In my case, I learned to speak Spanish. Let's say I can defend myself with Spanish from the age of 14, 15 years old. But there are many young women, many people in the territory who do not know how to speak Spanish. We do not know how to speak English. We do not know how to speak another language. And many times, that situation has made it difficult for us to participate. Many times it prevents us from accessing calls, for example. Another issue is the recognition of being Indigenous. There are many countries where indigenous peoples are not recognized. ILO Convention 169 is not ratified. In Colombia, for example, yes, but in Colombia the rights of women and young people are won through Ingas, which is literally that you have to go out on the tracks to claim rights that are already there. Although there is a national development plan in Colombia, it is a plan that places women and youth in the transversal, where that of the transversal is lost. That is, we get lost there when it is said, it is that youth, it is that indigenous women are transversal. There is no specific recognition as such. There is no specific resource for indigenous women and youth. On the other hand, another challenge that I feel we also have within the same indigenous organizations is that many of these are very masculine. I explain myself a little. It is that the leader is often a man, true, the authorities are often men. So there is a great challenge for the same organization so that we can sit down and talk to a colleague and tell him, colleague, you have to think about indigenous women. You have to begin to see that it is not by obligation, but by parity, by duality. We are both. You have to think about indigenous women so that in one way or another we can talk about climate change, to be able to talk about global warming so that we can talk about many issues. So that spirituality, you can also dialogue in one way or another in the territories. Because all this that you are seeing is a body and a territory at the same time, which has to do in conjunction with the spirituality and has to be seen within the organizations so that there is a territorial essence, so that there is an essence in favor of Mother Earth. Then it seems that we see an organizational political issue a little different. With women, it seems that it is an issue because we are left aside. In addition to having this problem with the state, obviously, and it is a big challenge also internally, because it must be said and it is also a reality. There is a lot of male leadership that inhibits women and youth from starting to talk. Let's say there is a law of origin. This is that I as a person and as a nation, have to be here. I have to think that men and women have to work together to be able to talk about climate, to be able to talk about biodiversity, and so that all projects that can be presented to any institution can be realized and a better way can be given. Many times we do not find funding, we as women and young people, on the issue of climate and biodiversity. There are calls that often have many items, many asterisks, so to speak, or come out in other languages which we often do not know, and the lack of accompaniment that I've mentioned before makes one can say, how can I possibly access this? I do not have accompaniment, I do not have advice, I do not speak the language, and outside of that, many of those calls come out only for larger organizations and not for us. That is why accessing that resource so that there is funding for your community is very difficult for indigenous youth and women.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you very much. I know Jennifer is there, and Jennifer is here to all also have to leave because the meeting is going to start. But I would really like Jennifer to also just quickly just give us 2 minutes of your time. Just share that what should or could be the role of philanthropy in addressing and bridging the gender gap and increasing access to climate and biodiversity financing.
Thank you, Tina, and for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts. I apologize because I'm in a public place. but also because I'm wearing several different hats. It means that I have to leave in a few minutes to lead the negotiations of the International Indigenous Forum on conservation-related targets. Okay, so my other hat is that I belong to a philanthropic organization called Niatero, and we support Indigenous guardianship through supporting place-anchored partnerships primarily. What does this mean? We support peoples who are place-based. And as some of the earlier speakers have already shared, for many Indigenous communities, the leadership structure is very male. So we work with the leadership structures of indigenous communities, and usually they're male. So what we do is to require gender balance or women's representation. We also extend support for leadership fellows and the like, and we make sure that there is gender balance. Now, Niatero is also part of two important philanthropic pledges that were announced last year. One is the 1.7 billion announcement in Glasgow to support forests and the role of forests in mitigating climate change. The other is the 5 billion pledge to support biodiversity conservation. Now, our role, we have decided that our role within these networks or these groups of funders that have pledged that support is to ensure that there are Indigenous rights safeguards in the way the funds are disbursed. And part of that is recognizing the historical marginalization of Indigenous women. So this is the approach that we are hoping that these pledges would take, and we are working to develop a set of principles that would ensure equity and including gender equity in access to the funds. Going a step further, we're also pushing for including redress or a grievance mechanism, maybe not necessarily a redress mechanism, but a grievance mechanism so that these funders, their attention can be called in cases where we are not walking the talk or observing the principles that we have adopted. So thanks very much for this time that you have given me. And I wish this webinar every success. Thank you.
Thanks, Jing. I know the negotiation starts in a few minutes. So thank you so very much for taking the time. Also, because you've been working in the sector, we also wanted to hear what's being done and also sharing with the over a lot of people registered for this is kind of pathways going forward. So thanks a lot for being here with us, and all the best in the negotiations. And I'll be also seeing you somewhere around the venue. So thank you so much. So I would also like take about, so we have about, so that was setting the stage of what the realities are and what the demands or what are the recommendations from different members of the network. We're also having Jing here to also explain some of these key financial mechanisms that are being put into place and the kind of awareness we need about them, but also what would be needed for those big biodiversity or climate finance mechanisms to take into considerations that there is do no harm, that there's also a mechanism to ensure that there is agenda budgeting, in simple words, if I may say so, for Indigenous women and also youth. I will also now open the floor now, because I saw some very interesting discussions on the chat. I would, if there is, because I can't see the chat fully, but if there is another person from our chat who would like to take the floor, I will be happy to share the question. Of course, again, going back to Kanlaya, but I'll have to start the discussion. what would be like, say, for example, like I know there's always a big funding gap also for Indigenous peoples and local communities, including women, and also the challenges in the language. What, okay, we have 20 minutes or so, so I will actually take the questions from the floor. I have a raised hand from Estella. And also please let me know if there is anybody else, just because our technical colleagues will help me. So Estella, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, sister, and to everyone present. My name is Estela Bejarano, and I speak to you from Jujuy in the north of the Argentine Republic, from a Koya community. From my community, we are working with others around climate change, which consequences we are already suffering. A high percentage of Koya communities live from the land, live from agriculture. I agree with everything the sister said about funding. I only have one suggestion I would like to make, and is that the requirements that are asked to communities could be a little happier, as we call it. That means that it can be understood and that communities can easily join that financing. Point 2. That there is enough communication and information. That funding information for various projects reaches the communities. As for the cases of projects that have been accepted, both at the national or local level, we would like to know the results of those projects that have been financed. Why do we ask for this? I explain. In 2018, we have received information from the brothers of the plurinational state of Bolivia, who came to the north of Argentina to inform us about the influence of climate change and desertification. That served us a lot, but later we no longer knew what happened with the project. Point 3. It is also important that women and young people be incorporated into these projects. Young people at the moment in this area are suffering a series of very strong social issues where drug trafficking is pushing them into their ranks, which is why they urgently require us as life-giving women to take care not only of our family and our community, but also of the context where we are. I would like to say more things, but I do not want to abuse the time you are giving me, but I share everything that has been said about women, sister. The international women's movement cannot be without our voice, nor can we accept projects that do not empower women, youth, girls, and adolescents. Thank you.
Estella, absolutely. Thank you very much for that very in-depth, again, reflection. I think we have a very good group of amazing women champions. I think, like you pointed out, the idea of having this session today was hoping that we would get these messages out to the CSW session that is taking place in New York. The theme for this year, again, a reminder, is on climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction. So we are hoping that we are going to be providing all these valuable inputs with also the participants who are following the CSW to help put these messages forward when these discussions are taking place. Like you said, I think following up on what Lotus talked about in the chat, that the true show of leadership of how Indigenous women are strategically engaging in global mechanisms. I think it's a very good example of Jane and other colleagues who are here, Lucy, who was not able to join us, in these different spaces and bringing the voices of Indigenous women, saying these are what is needed. For myself also, like I think that the CBD is taking place right now where I am, and financing, like I've mentioned, is a very big discussions around here. So I think, Estella, what you talked about is very key. And I think Diana from our youth talked about, it's participation. It's participation in also decision-making of how funds would be dispersed, but also what kind of programming or policy that would be needed to put in place at the national level that can have access for Indigenous women. I will just take a quick call, again, I see a hand from Shoma. I only know Shoma from India, to share her views. But I would also encourage you, because now we have very little time, if you could be very short, so we'll also have other responses.
Yeah, I'll be very brief and specific to the discussions that we have been listening to since yesterday in the assembly, where we were told to push back on the pushback. I think for Indigenous communities and marginalized women, the issue of pushback is 3 times over, because they are receiving a lot of backlash as women, as Indigenous women, as women living in areas that are resource rich, that others have their eye on to grab. So there is 3 times over backlash on the Indigenous communities. Now, there are discussions being held with the policymakers at the Vienna Cafe, where I think it's important for this group to be represented and the issues to be raised there on the issues of biodiversity and the role of women in conserving biodiversity, in managing natural resources, and actually living in harmony with nature, and how that needs to be an integral part of the statement that comes out at the end of the conference. And therefore, I would urge the members here to try and put those issues that you're also discussing at the Biodiversity Convention. I know that Rinalini, Jennifer, and others are plugging hard at that too, that there should be an interlocking of these issues, and we need to look at the intersectionalities and how they play out, and urge our governments to look at that as a priority area of consideration to recognize women in leadership and defining the pathways forward. Thank you.
Shoma, thank you very, very much also for the strong message. And I think it really guides our work. Also here, like I said, some of our colleagues. Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Shoma, can you hear me? Or everybody can hear me? You can just give me
Okay,
a thumbs up.
I'm done. I just didn't want to take more time. I think I should give space to others.
Okay.
But thank you so much for the time. Yeah.
Thank you, Shoma. Thank you. No, absolutely. And I think this was a very key idea. And with that view is where Women for Biodiversity, Afib, and FEMI has come together, because all of us are partly following the CSW 66 and are also here at the CBD to also ensure how can we bring these synergies together, because Indigenous women are also in the intersectionality of these meetings, and we're talking about the same things. So how do we really also take these collective messages in not only the CBD, not only the CSW, but also the other global processes? And I think this is also a time for us, so in acknowledging that it's time for us to bring these, build and strengthen these synergies to strengthen our voices on these issues. So thank you very much. I also see some really good, my apologies, I'm just seeing it here, that there's some translation is overlapping. I hope it's okay right now for everybody. I also want to, is there any other colleagues, also the panelists, who would like to take the floor to share any other perspectives, including maybe Lotus, because I think a lot of them also have been questions on philanthropy, funding, and how that could also be strengthened. So would you like to also share a few words?
Yes, thank you. And thank you for all the comments that are you're all sharing on the chat. It's exciting to see how we are all active participants, but also bringing ideas on which we can work and collaborate. I think from Afib's point of view, we have been always a funder network that has been focused on educating and promoting thought partnerships as well as funding practices. But I think more and more, and as evidenced not only from this webinar, but other conversations and other partnerships that IFIP continues to form, both with the Indigenous Women's Movement, but also with Indigenous peoples' movements and organizations and networks, we see as critical to also, as an organization, while we focus on philanthropy, not only to just be an allyship, but work in parallel to the movement, and to be here to discuss and strategize as well. How do we together continue to keep philanthropy transparent and accountable? You heard earlier from Ying those pledges that were made at the climate COP. From IFIP's perspective, knowing the history of philanthropy, our focus and attention as IFIP is to call on transparency and accountability, and so that there is funding going directly to these Indigenous communities as well as Indigenous organizations. What we see is, and we continue to see, is the challenging world of funding, which sometimes is not very transparent or not very accountable. And so this is just an expression from my part, and I know my colleagues who are on the call as well, that IFIP is here to work with the movement, with FIMI, who is here to strategize, to work collaboratively, and to really continue to push in philanthropic spaces, as well as open new philanthropic spaces. There's many other areas or many other philanthropic spaces in which we have yet to have conversations. And from our end, I think one of the best ways to start a conversation is to have this both direct and the relationship building also that comes with engaging in conversations with funders, and to move the philanthropic sector from seeing both Indigenous peoples, but certainly Indigenous women's organizations, as beneficiaries only. They're actors, change agents, negotiators, and they're just we're bringing a very different way of engaging with these processes, because it comes from a place of both lifting up both our individual but also collective rights of Indigenous peoples.
No, thank you, Laura. That was also a very good reflection. I think I'll just kind of take on from that. What you talked about is that in the global space, both in the climate or at least the biodiversity, there is this discussion of this huge funding mechanism that are being discussed. And as you pointed out, it is really very important that these fundings that are also supposed to be supporting Indigenous peoples has a very strong accountability mechanism and transparency, and also safeguards. I think safeguards is something that we also really need to see, is how to also make sure that these financing mechanisms don't violate the rights of Indigenous peoples or the kind of projects that are going to be proposed for that. So there is a discussion, and I think going from there, saying that there is this growing space for also recognizing that Indigenous peoples need to fund their own funds, and to see hopefully that would also be growing, that the funds are given to Indigenous-led organizations to be able to do their own programming the way they also feel should be done, giving the right to choose basically the way they would want to use those funds, that it's the biodiversity financing or climate financing. So thank you so very much for your important comments. I also shared that Lotus also shared a document that Afib is calling funders to be transparent and accountable towards the commitment they have made in connection to the climate COP. And like I said, these are the kind of collaborations we are looking for, is that kind of work will also help us at the Biodiversity to kind of use these examples of aligning ourselves. So having said that, and also for the space given from everybody, thank you so much for this opportunity to bringing these rich experiences. And I know we could have maybe had this session longer, but we are also running out of time. So I would like to go at the end of the session and and invite Teresa from FIMI. Teresa Zapata Mendoza is an indigenous Maya Kijik woman originally from Guatemala, and she is the executive director of the International Indigenous Women's Forum, FIMI. Among many other roles, Teresa has also worked as a government official in Indigenous Women's Program of the Central America region in UN Women. She's also been linked to the struggle of Indigenous women for more than 15 years. Teresa, the floor is yours to guide us to this closing of this session.
Gracias, Mirinali. Pues muy agradecidas con la vida, con el universo, con las energías de cada una de las que están el día de hoy, pero también quienes nos están siguiendo, escuchando a través de las redes sociales, también de las energías de quienes están en este momento en mesas de negociación, siendo esa voz directa para llevar todos estos retos, pero también los aportes. Yo quisiera empezar por saludar, valorar, reconocer en toda la dimensión el liderazgo de las mujeres indígenas. Somos sujetas de derechos, somos sujetas individuales y también colectivas, y escuchar la voz acá de las hermanas de las distintas regiones, escuchar sus experiencias, su conocimiento, todo ese bagaje de trabajo que se trae, yo digo, si nos permitieran, si nos dieran ese espacio que nos corresponde para la toma de decisiones, tendríamos un mundo diferente, más complementario, porque tenemos una visión amplia, tenemos una visión colectiva, no individualista, y tenemos una visión que cuando yo escuchaba a las hermanas, yo decía realmente en la cultura maya, para nosotros el caracol, ese símbolo circular, es tan importante porque realmente así es nuestra existencia. Somos un ciclo en donde se entrelaza e interacciona tantos elementos de la vida, pero también de nuestras problemáticas, nuestras apuestas, nuestros aportes. Y ese es el primer elemento que quisiera hoy poner sobre la mesa, ese grito que las mujeres indígenas seguimos poniendo, de decir somos sujetas de derechos, como lo decía Diana, acompáñennos, pero también permítennos ser y aportar. El segundo aspecto que quisiera abordar acá es un poco en relación a los retos que ya las compañeras lo mencionaron. Son tantos, innumerables, que un webinar no nos da como para poder profundizarlos. Recientemente tuvimos la Conferencia Global de Mujeres Indígenas el año pasado, en agosto, y muchos de estos temas y de estas preocupaciones, pero también de buenas prácticas, fueron mencionadas. Tenemos en la Declaración Global de esta conferencia, creo que recomendaciones, pero también información importante que podemos seguir usando como una herramienta política ya integrada y que ha sido consensuada por más de 500 mujeres indígenas que participaron de forma virtual, pero que a su vez venían trayendo la voz de otras mujeres en el nivel comunitario. Por supuesto que el tema de los idiomas colonialistas siguen siendo un peso sobre nuestro desarrollo. Un peso porque no deja que avancemos, no permite que nosotras logremos accesar a la educación, a la formación, a la toma de decisión política y no logramos accesar al financiamiento. O sea, son varios elementos y sigue siendo una herramienta del colonialismo. Sin embargo, es nuestra realidad. Lo mencionaba acá la compañera Canlaya. Asia. Asia es el ejemplo más grande de este reto, porque tal como se decía, la diversidad de los idiomas es un tema a abordar y a seguir reflexionando, porque no es tan sencillo como decir, bueno, ahora escribamos los proyectos en nuestros idiomas. Sí, pero hay toda una dinámica difícil de romper, porque somos una cadenita que vamos, una organización local se apoya con una nacional se apoya con la internacional, y ahí ya empezamos a tener entonces estos retos para establecer nuestras alianzas. Nos encontramos que hay idiomas colonialistas que las tenemos que usar o nos quedamos fuera. Y el reto ahora es seguir reflexionando cuáles deben de ser nuestras estrategias para seguir trabajando al respecto. No podemos pensar que vamos a poder usar todos nuestros idiomas a la vez en un ámbito internacional, pero tampoco podemos dejar de pensar que nuestras herramientas no deben de ser adecuadas para tomar en cuenta este aspecto. Otro elemento que se mencionó y que quiero tomarme unos segundos para abordar es el tema del fortalecimiento organizativo. Si bien hay mucha experiencia organizativa a nivel local, a nivel comunitario, nos encontramos nuevamente con otra regla del colonialismo, que es el registro legal de nuestras organizaciones para poder accesar al financiamiento. Sabemos bien que hay capacidad, hay experiencia, hay habilidades, hay liderazgo, pero nos topamos que para accesar a los fondos necesitamos una cuenta bancaria, necesitamos un estatus legal. ¿Qué se está haciendo ahora en la experiencia que hemos notado? Muchas organizaciones dependen de patrocinadores fiscales. Esos patrocinadores fiscales muchas veces no son indígenas o son organizaciones lideradas por varones. Es otra barrera. Y esto va en escala, porque en el caso de FIMI, que también tenemos un fondo, un brazo filantrópico que es AINI, nosotras podemos contribuir a ser patrocinadores fiscales en algunas ocasiones, pero nos encontramos que frente a los donantes, nosotras tenemos que demostrar que las organizaciones que recibieron los fondos los recibieron de manera en el marco de la legalidad, ¿no? O sea, hay muchos retos en ese sentido. Y en este tema del registro y del acceso al financiamiento, algo que creo que no se mencionó, son las políticas gubernamentales que se están dando principalmente en esta década y en estos últimos años para restringir el poder recibir fondos para las organizaciones. Está sucediendo en África, en Asia, en América Latina y en todo el mundo. ¿Cómo podemos establecer alianzas para hacer frente a esta situación? Defender a los defensores, que ya no pueden ni siquiera recibir recursos para poder hacer sus procesos. Esto es un elemento importante. Otro aspecto que creo que no mencionamos y vale la pena ponerlo sobre la mesa es que además de estos retos que tenemos las mujeres indígenas, que ya tenemos un acceso a la información, que ya estamos en esta arena, hay dentro de nuestros pueblos otras diversidades y otras necesidades. Por ejemplo, la situación de las mujeres indígenas como personas con discapacidades. Ahí hay otro gran esfuerzo que hacer para poder incluir en nuestra agenda todas estas diversidades que encontramos en nuestros pueblos. Desde FIMI, nosotras hemos producido una cantidad de documentos. De hecho, lo que les estoy comentando ahora en relación a estos retos, lo que hoy salió de voz de Dayana, de Canlaya, de Jennifer y de Lucy, que no pudo estar, pero que conocemos también de ese récord de ella, está recogido en nuestra declaración que hemos hecho en el marco de CSW de este año. Es una declaración que recoge estas preocupaciones, las buenas prácticas y las recomendaciones. Las invito a seguir usando la Declaración Global de las Mujeres Indígenas. También nosotras preparamos en el 2020 un documento, balance de la situación de las mujeres indígenas en el marco de los 25 años de Beijing. Ahí también tenemos documentos. Hemos producido datos desde lo local, haciendo investigación comunitaria. Tenemos algunos documentos que ustedes pueden encontrar en nuestra página web. Y desde nuestro fondo AINI, nosotras tomamos todas estas recomendaciones, estas preocupaciones, hacemos lo que humanamente es posible para tratar de acercar los recursos. Pero sigue estando esa invitación, por ejemplo, de lo que se mencionó al terminar el año pasado el Foro de Generación Igualdad. Se dijo, los estados asumieron que van a movilizar y van a poner 40,000 millones de dólares para la igualdad de género. ¿Dónde están? Todo el financiamiento para el clima, ¿dónde está? Yo mientras escuchaba las intervenciones decía, o sea, aparentemente hay dinero, hay financiamiento, pero son como globos que pasan acá arriba y que las mujeres indígenas estamos tratando de agarrar algo de ese globo, pero no está, por decir, este globo va dedicado a las mujeres indígenas, acciones afirmativas. Creo que tenemos que seguir insistiendo en acciones afirmativas. De lo contrario, es una lluvia que si logras agarrar algo, bien te va, y si no, no agarras nada. Eso es lo que está pasando en el mundo del financiamiento. Y refrendo lo que hemos dicho siempre y lo seguiremos diciendo, nada sobre nosotras, sin nosotras. Gracias, Lourdes, gracias a cada una por hacer esta alianza. Mientras seamos más y hablemos juntas, creo que vamos a ser más fuertes. Y bueno, seguimos en este camino. Gracias de nuevo.
Thank you so much. I have no capacity to follow those strong words. It was a very well put, and also a very good wrap up. No, this is, I think, looking at that we are from different regions, we are from different Indigenous communities all around the world, following different spaces, but to also come together, including with the language barrier. I want to be part of that, is to see that the situation is the same. Our voices, the demands, regardless of wherever we are coming from, is the same. But I think, like what you talked about, is to still be affirmative about it, but also seeing that there is hope, that we're building these alliances across different processes with and among each other, and hopefully that we will be stronger together to ensuring that we have gender just or Indigenous women's rights taken into consideration when any kind of financing is thought about. I think it's about time. So thank you so very much for the speakers, for the panelists, for all the participants who joined from different time zones. And this shows us why we need it. Because of different time zones, everybody is joining in. And to take these messages forward, So as a last request, if everybody could have your videos on for a minute, so we will also capture some of the shots. This is unfortunately, we're still doing so many things virtually. And also my apologies, I see one or two hands up while I'm scrolling the screen. I think one is Marco. My apologies that I missed calling on you, but please just stay in touch. All our emails are there. You have the emails, and we will be happy to share information and take some of the suggestions forward. So I'll just ask our comms to take photo, and I'm going to quickly run through the screen. It is wonderful to see so many people from different regions and countries.
Taking page one. Page one.
Yeah, as Claire is taking photos or communications, I also want to take this opportunity to thank our technical team, but also the interpreters, without which I think we could have lost also getting these messages, because again, unfortunately, we are hosting this webinar, this event in English. So thank you very much for providing that support, and hopefully you all been able to speak slow enough. It's not been too difficult. So having said that, once again, thank you very much. Let's do this collectively. Let's take these messages in all the forums that we are going, and let's stay in touch. I think that's a very important thing. Let's stay in touch. You all are in the mailing list registered, and if it's okay, we will follow this webinar up with an email and let us know how or what other elements that you would want us in the future that we may again host that you would be interested. So thank you very much from my side. And with this, I will officially close the side event.